of the issues which we left for us to discuss, legacy of Orientalism. What is the problem that Orientalism is trying to resolve or trying to describe? The second part I'm going to talk about is the actual critique of Orientalism, just to remind people what was it that the side actually said and why it is challenging. In the third part, I'm going to try and think about how we can reorient some of those insights rather than just rethinking the need for reorienting. So those are my three main categories I'll begin with. But let me start with somewhere very contemporary, which is, those of you who are familiar with English will probably realize that in many marches of solidarity in relation to the events happening in Gaza and in general about the oppression of the Palestinian people. And one of the slogans which is chanted out at these marches, which has now, in some cases, have been, according to some people, been 500 million strong, which is a huge number in the context of the UK, has been the slogan that in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. And I want to explore a little bit what this slogan means. Why is it that people, A, use that slogan, and nearly all of those people marching are not all Palestinians, they're not even all Muslims. There's a cross-section of people who are marching up to that slogan and shouting that slogan. So when they say we are all Palestinians, what does that mean and why might that be important? And the reason I want to talk about this is because I think it's a good way of trying to understand some of the challenges faced by the critique of Orientalism. So firstly, I think one way of thinking about the current situation is the dehumanization of Palestinians. And I don't need to labor over that remark because I think everyone will understand this is something that has been going on quite often, for 100 years, but it's now reached a certain crescendo where it doesn't mean that Palestinian lives do not seem to matter at all or matter much less than other people's lives. But then there's a second related phenomenon, which I would say to you is the Palestinianization of Muslims. That in many parts of the world, where you have the situation of what the Palestinians are suffering, become a template, a model, a way of dealing with Muslims. And this, you could refer to what happened, for example, to the Rohingya, who were ethnically cleansed before our eyes. Everyone in this room would be able to, I think everyone in this room was probably alive at the time when it happened and would have been conscious of that. You can think about what is happening in relation to Muslims in India, or the Muslims in China, or the Muslims in Kashmir, etc. You can multiply these examples, and you can see the direct correlation of techniques, protocols, policies from one place to the other. That the idea of Palestinianization as a solution to the Muslim question is taken up by many different regimes. So in that sense, it makes one can understand why instinctively Muslims understand how the Palestinian case resonates with them. It means something to them, even if they're not Palestinian, even if they've never been to Palestine, even if they're not they don't border the occupied territory of Palestine. But there's another issue which I'd like to also draw attention to, and that is the Palestinianization of the people itself. Right now, in the world, there are very few countries in which have popular support for their anti-Palestinian policy. And what you're seeing in, for example, in France, pro-Palestinian demonstrations have been banned by law several times. But remember, this is same France which a few years ago in the wake of the killing of Charlie Hebdo, organized a march for the freedom of expression. And this is not just an odd example. You can see that with the counterexample of what's happened in the Ukraine and what is happening in Palestine. So what you have is a divergence between governments and the demand for people to have some say in the shape of the world that is being formed around them. So I would talk to the Palestinization of the people is also something to be concerned about, simply because many of the techniques used to make Palestinians, to control Palestinians, to subject them, become techniques that are used elsewhere in police forces, in policies, for all over the world. And we have a very clear example of Black Lives Matter, when police using techniques perfected in the West Bank against protests for ending police brutality against Black people in the United States. So in a way, Palestinianization is not just a rhetorical device, it is actually behind much of the way in which populations of the people all over the world are now being considered to be something which is to be controlled, to be regulated, something which is in denial of their rights. Everything is done in the name of the people, but the people are nowhere allowed to be seen, they're nowhere allowed to be heard, and they're definitely not allowed to have a voice. And this is not just happening to the Palestinians, but you can see how those techniques expand. Because you allow it to happen once, in one place, then it becomes something that others can do elsewhere. Now, one of the issues has been that those who have been opposing pro-Palestinian rights are also being those who have been critical of Ibn Said and the critique of Orientalism. This is not just because Ibn Said was a Palestinian and an advocate for Palestinian autonomy and Palestinian nationalism, but also because they see with the idea of Palestine is an anti-colonial struggle, an anti-colonial struggle is an anti-racial struggle, it's also a struggle against white supremacy. So there is an opposition between those who consider Orientalism to be, the critique of Orientalism, to be a major problem in corrupting useful minds, corrupting the university systems across the world, who are also then supporters of the opposition to Palestinian rights. So this, in a way, kind of provides a quick link to the question about what is happening in Palestine and the topic today about rethinking Orientalism. Because what we've seen is a result of multiple ways in which Orientalist tropes, Orientalist imagery has been used to try and tell a very different story about the Palestinian resistance to oppression. Let me just ask you, if there's only one thing that you take away from this lecture from me, I would ask you to take away this quote. And that's all. I have nothing more to say after that, so if you take from this quote, then I think I've done enough. But really, it's about the notion in which the world that we live in, the categories and concepts that we use, are validated not by the world itself, but by the language of the concepts and categories we use. To give you an example of this, I'm going to try and show you these two maps. One of them you will recognize is a very similar way that the map that Jamal showed in his slides, and the other is a slightly different one. Can anyone see the difference in which map is the most accurate? Any hands? Map B. Who's the one person saying map B is not? Anyone else? B. Okay. So there's some voices saying map B is more accurate. The question is a trick question because, in a sense, both are representations. What map B does is gives you a very good sense of the true area of the world. And if you look at, for example, map A, you'll notice that Greenland is almost bigger, if not bigger than Africa. In reality, you can see Africa is much, much bigger. However, you can see that through this, there's a certain distortion in terms of the shape, etc. But the reason for I asked is, what about which is the most accurate, but which is the most useful? And the use depends on what we're trying to use it for. And therefore, I would say to you, map A or map B is really a question about which map tells us the story of the world that we want to live in. And it will not surprise you that up till very recently, map A was the hegemonic map used in the Anglosphere, which basically said this is the accurate representation of the world. And many, many children all over the world grew up looking at that map and then thinking how small they are compared to Europe. And that is something that they end up following through and accepting. Now, the map itself is a product of a process of European world making that perhaps began 500 years ago, perhaps began 200 years ago. I don't want to get into that. But it was really a combination of the idea that what was science was European, what was racial rule was European, and what was cultural exception was European. In a sense, what you have in European colonial enterprise is the combination of epistemology, how we know about things, European identity, it's only Europeans can know about things, and we have the idea of empire, which is central to what it is to be European. And you can see the traces of that still exist now, that the idea that Europe has a privileged position to adjudicate and to determine the fate of others in the world, and it's locked into European identity. And when I say European, I mean Western, but there are people from the United States here or from elsewhere. I'm just using European in a general sense. So in a way, what you have is the very production of knowledge combines these three elements, so much so that if you look at university, and this is a new university, and many universities, but nearly throughout this planet, all the universities are basically based on a template of European universities, which emerged in the 18th, 19th century. Though nearly all the universities say, not all of them, many of them say they're much older than that. So you take, for example, the organization of disciplines. We have two disciplines which were established: sociology, which was basically the study of European society, and anthropology, which was the study of primitive, i.e. non-European society. And I know if there are any apologies to any anthropologists in the room who say that they have overcome this and they no longer do this sort of thing, but the idea of having two disciplines to study basically human society was itself an idea of preserving the difference between what was European and what was non-European. And as a result, you have a kind of an argument in which European identity is always contrasted with non-European identity. So you can see that between traditional and modern. And you will see this in many, many countries, which may be considered by some to be non-European, who you'll have a segment of the population that will say they're modern. And what does modern mean? That they dress in a particular way, they eat in a particular way, they think in a particular way. And then you have a segment of the population which they consider to be traditional, which is considered to be rural, which is considered to be religious, which is considered to be backward, etc., etc., etc. So this division between the West and the rest is not only a geopolitical division, it's a division that runs through all of the world in different ways. You have islands of modernity and islands of Westernness all over the world. And they will be making these kinds of distinctions and divisions. So, in a sense, part of the Orientalism is really the critique of Orientalism is looking at how we arrive at this distinction between um, the West and the rest, and what it implies. Again, just to give you a very quick example, there is one of the things that we see between the division between the West and the rest is how continuous it is. You can have the same headlines from 10, 20 years and rewritten again. And I will imagine that if this situation in Gaza continues, someone will put out a line that there will new headline will be the crisis once more, because they will say, look, what is happening in the Muslim world, in these countries, is instability because they don't agree with what we're doing. I mean, that's basically the logic situation. So we have this version that many of the objects, many of the ways that we understand the world is always being present. And we can talk about these always being present unproblematically. So to give you an example, in this country, there's often a confusion between what is Europe and what is Asia. Let me add to that confusion. Let me say to you that Asia is itself a European concept. We know that what we call Asia has been a host to at least 3 distinct literate complex cultures, which are at least 3,000 to 4,000 years old in terms of the record. But when we look at this record, none of them ever talk about Asia. Asia is a European invention. However, we are trapped in that invention. When we need to talk about, for example, Bandung, or we need to talk about some of the recent events, we are already talking about Asia as being more meaningful than some other identification. So we are already called, say, Asia, or Africa, or West. All of these are themselves constructions, and we've forgotten that they're constructions, and we hope that they will help us. But they already have made a division, and we can already call ourselves. So normally when I ask this question, there's often a division between people are very, very clear whether they know which continent they are. But out of respect for the kind of hybrid liminal position that some people may find themselves in, I won't ask this question. But the question about most people will name the continent, and they will think the continent is something ancient, something natural, something that's always been there. When in fact, the continents themselves are products of the map that have been made by Europe, and which we now find ourselves in. Now, some of this process is quite straightforward, and I think it's something that we can, quite understand. And I think that, again, if it's Khaldun's sort of summary, that basically the argument is that the colonizers lost their ability to be independent, which was both a political, a military inability, but it also has a cultural comportment to it. Now, the critique of Oriental studies, there are a number of people, Marshall Hudson and Malik, which began to do this, and this is the real second part of what I want to say, really, is how we think about Orientalism and why the critique of Orientalism came about. And it's important to note that when this critique begins to emerge, what were the circumstances around it? So Marshall Hudson was finishing off basically a lot of his work in the 1950s, but when he published in the 70s, and the side 78, and in Marshall, this is a period of the anti-colonial struggle. After the Second World War, and it is the beginning of the anti-colonial struggle and the momentum of that. So the critique of Oriental studies is linked to anti-colonial context. I think people know that there are mainly 3 main books which have been associated and then with this kind of, apart from Orientalism, so I wrote. So the idea here is then to look at this, and the second part is to look at the history of the concept, is to see why after its, almost 40 years after its publication, Orientalism still continues. I think you need to reflect on this for a little bit, because most books of social sciences and humanities do not have such a long shelf life. They do not carry on for that long. For that book to be carrying on for that long suggests that it has certain relevance and it still triggers not only books but also conferences. Now, what was interesting about Said's book, as everyone knows, is that he was one of the first people writing in English to take some of the ideas coming out of post-structuralism in France, particularly Michel Foucault's concept of discourse, and combine it with Gramsci's concept of hegemony, which is really the key element of Orientalism, the critique of Orientalism. Now, hegemony is really the idea of how one particular discourse, one particular narrative becomes established, so all other narratives reproduce its logic. And this, I think, is really important because it argues that what we call truth is often a function of hegemony rather than anything natural. To go back to the map that I showed you, what we think is the true shape of the Earth is a product of which maps we're used to, rather than actually the shape of the Earth itself. That's how we understand it, that's how we work through it. And similarly, with the notion of discourse, it's not that discourses are just expressive, but they're also constitutive. They end up making social reality. We understand social reality in different ways because of the language that we use. So, for example, if you think Hamas is a terrorist organization, you are creating a social reality in relation to how you understand them, what you agree with them, you disagree with them, you understand their policies not. If you think they're freedom fighters, you will have a different comportment, different set of policies, etc. So discourses are not just words, but they're also deeds in terms of they actually transform how we relate to these things. Now, Edward Said gives three main points of a definition of Orientalism throughout his book. And I think many people will be familiar with that. Firstly, he argues that it's an academic description that includes all teaching and research about the Orient. Talks about it as being a style of thought and a corporate enterprise for managing relations with the Orient. In his critique and subsequent critique, he's actually breaking the claim that Orientalism is a transparent reading of the East. That Orientalism is actually a science for understanding the Orient. It is not a science for understanding the Orient, it is a science for making the Orient. And this is a really important distinction, because Orientalists say all they're doing is describing what already exists. And what he's trying to argue is that you're not describing what already exists, you're bringing into existence already your preconceived idea. He rejects also the notion of an Orientalist as politically neutral. I think it was already mentioned that, for example, people like Bernard Lewis were not just academics, they were influential in forming American foreign policy towards Muslims, the Middle East, etc. So he kind of says that Orientalists were not just academics, but they were all kinds of people. They were governors of provinces, they were colonial administrators, all of whom were engaged in Orientalism, which again is something to think about, that an academic subject is no longer just something you do in the academy, it is something which goes beyond the academy, influencing policy, influencing society, influencing culture. And he then says there's a complicity between Orientalism and imperialism. Again, that imperialism was enabled by Orientalism and helped enable and enrich Orientalism. So they were part of a similar kind of process. They helped one another and they moved towards something. Now, the criticisms of Said have been many, and they've tended to focus on the fact that he is he's basically giving an essentialist image of the Orientalist, because there were many different kinds of Orientalists. There were many divided of them. Some of them were very, very good, and some of them were bad. But many of them were just honest people, etc., etc. And there's also the idea that what the Orientalists are trying to describe as a real Orient, and the societies are really like that, or that the bias that he says exists in Oriental studies can be found everywhere. Bias is just a human quality. Everyone can be biased. So he's accused of distortion. He was accused of distortion, and again, people still talk about Orientalism as being distorted. He's accused of being confusing the academic with the political. Again, there's a criticism that people who do academic work should be treated academically, etc. Now the problem is this: that within Orientalism, I would say there are two types of critique. There's one which is a weak Orientalism, which I call legal, which is basically the idea that Orientalism is produced by institutional links, by misrepresentation, by organizations involved in exploitation of the Orient, who then produce Orientalism. So, for example, everyone knows that many American companies gained a lot from the Iraq War, or the famous slogan, "No blood for oil," kind of idea was that the United States went into Iraq to acquire Iraqi oil, etc. And the idea would be that you would show the relationship between academic or oriented outcomes and the funding sources, etc., to work out the true essence of those things. So in a sense, this is basically a sociology of knowledge approach. How does knowledge get produced? Who funds it? What are their links? What are their agendas, etc. Then there is the strong Orientalism, which is what I really want to fix upon. And that is, the idea is that Orientalism isn't really about the Orient. Orientalism is and has always been about the West. It is a way that the West tells a story of itself. And therefore, Orientalism is really a philosophical enterprise, not just an enterprise of area studies. Now I want to turn to my third part of what I want to say, is and really talk about the implications. If you accept this strong Orientalism, if you accept what I'm saying about the philosophical nature of Orientalism, then a number of consequences follow. First, the question is really, we are in a context of what does it mean if Orientalism provides us not just the descriptions, but our very way of thinking about the social and the human. How can we think around this? Is there a way around it? There is a famous quote by Audre Lorde here, who says, "The master's real tools will never dismantle the master's house." It would seem to suggest that Orientalism can never be dismantled by Orientalism. In a sense, that Orientalism already provides is part of that kind of hegemony of the West, and therefore, what tools we have to undo it are going to be limited. Now, a number of scholars started talking about decolonizing many things, and one way of thinking about Orientalism would be the idea of decolonizing the philosophical foundations which underlie all social science. All the social sciences that you are taught anywhere on the planet are basically based on the sequence which goes from favor to next. They're based on Western philosophy translated into social science categories. And as a consequence, what I will argue is that Orientalism is not a branch of the Western Academy. It's not just something, a department of Oriental Studies or under its modern name, Islamic Studies or Area Studies or whatever. It is not a branch of academic endeavor. But the very possibility of producing knowledge as being Western. Let me say it again because there's a difference. If you think Orientalism is simply about the Orient, and it's something that you study in area studies or Middle Eastern studies, for example, then you could say, well, if we have better scholarship in Middle East study departments, we will get rid of Orientalism. What I'm suggesting to you is that Orientalism is not found just in Middle East study departments, not just in anthropology, but is actually haunts all social science knowledge. Every single social science has some idea of what is normal, what is ordinary, what is natural. Try and think of a social science which does not make some comparative statement, implicitly or explicitly. If you study the family, you already have a notion of the family. If you study industry, you have a notion of what is not industry. And what I'm saying to you is this, that the very possibility of producing knowledge rests upon saying what is not Western as well as what is Western. So if you go back to the slide that I showed between the West and the rest, you cannot have the West without having a notion of the rest. You cannot have social science without having a notion of what is not normal, what is not abnormal, what is not subject to social science. So whatever you may be studying, in whichever field that you may find yourself in, whether it's sociology or it's international relations, you will be studying something which has an implicit comparative dimension to it. And in that sense, what I would argue is that Orientalism haunts the production of social sciences and humanities. That the trace of the Orient is to be found in all of these places because you cannot have literary studies, you cannot have philosophy, you cannot have any discipline without the idea that that discipline itself is in comparison with something else. And that something else is one way of thinking of the Orient. So in that case, what I'm doing is, if you remember the PowerPoint that I showed earlier, where Edward Said talks about Orientalism, the first thing he says is academic discipline for studying the Orient. And what I'm trying to do is, with this argument, is expand that to say it's not a academic discipline, but it's a very academic idea of academic discipline, which is really involved in the Orient. But Orientalism is not something that you do when you study Sanskrit or Arabic or Sumerian or these languages. Orientalism is what you do when you just think you're doing social science or when you just think you're doing math. You are involved in reproducing Orientalism. So, having said that, in the remaining time I have, I'd like to suggest the question really should be, what should we do? I think it's important to remember that when people talk about decolonization, there has been in many parts of the global north, especially in the Anglosphere, there has been a great, in the last few years, emphasis on decoloniality and decolonizing curricula and decolonizing text. It would be interesting to note how many of these great decolonial scholars and initiatives have anything to say about what's happening in Palestine right now. So in a way, part of it is, how do we understand the decolonial in relation to not just the present, but in relation to its own anti-colonial past. Now, Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, described the idea of decolonization as always a violent phenomenon. I think many people simply read that and say, well, he's advocating armed struggle. I don't think that's almost against armed struggle, but the violence is actually more than just armed struggle, because the violence we're talking about is a complete uprooting. Imagine a society which has been transformed so much so that it cannot understand its own languages, that it cannot understand its own its names, it cannot understand how it has come into being. In a sense, the effect of colonialism was that kind of re-radical writing of those histories and the rupture that it did with all these societies. And in a sense, Orientalism is a way of actually normalizing the position of the Orient as subjugated, as a necessarily subjugated element. So to do decolonization requires an uprooting, a literal uprooting of the way that we think and comport ourselves, how we understand the world that we live in. One of the interesting things about the 1985 edition of Orientalism is that he introduces the category of Islamophobia, one of the earlier people to read these discussions. And it's important that we understand that relationship between Orientalism and Islamophobia. Not that all Orientalism is always Islamophobic, but all Islamophobia is always going to be Oriental. It's always going to partake of Orientalism. And this, it seems to me, is a gateway to explaining some of the things we're talking about in relation to the mismatch between the suffering inflicted upon the people of Gaza and the sympathy or sentimental empathy from many, many governments, many of those who were incredibly sympathetic and empathetic to what was happening in Ukraine, for example. So, in a way, I would always see these two things often coming together to producing a scenario in which there is a denial of Muslim political agency. And in that sense, it seems to me that we need to ask and recognize that rethinking Orientalism involves us in completing a process of decolonization, but not just decolonization from countries where there was direct colonial rule. So it's not just extending decolonization, but it's deepening the process of decolonization. And that rethinking, it seems to me, is really necessary if we want to reorient the critique of Orientalism. Because the task for us now is not just to think about doing these critiques, because in a sense we already know that the knowledge that is being produced is not neutral, it's not transparent, etc. The much more difficult task is what do we do with that knowledge? If we know that the knowledges of the universities that we're building, that the syllabuses that we're teaching are teaching our subjugation, not our emancipation, what can we do? What is it that we can do? So decolonization has to be finished because its ideological and cultural bases are still prevalent. Wherever you find them, still exist. And the true way of rethinking Orientalism would be to think about it in the colonial terms. So, I'd like to sort of suggest maybe three possibilities that we might want to rethink Orientalism and what is to be done. Some of them, one of them you recognize is almost a direct reference to what Yeniden was saying about a new world history. So I would say a new world history of the future as well as history of the past. But the first thing is that we need to be able to imagine the post-West. And we need to do this with a degree of courage and without apology. I think we are still finding it very difficult to summon that courage to think through whether we're post-West. And partly it's because of our own training, partly because whenever we are confronted with challenges, we go back to our default position, which is what we have been taught and we've been socialized over 20, 30 years. So we do not know what it is to think without the West. And that, in a sense, recaptures us in that jail, in that picture. I think the second thing that I wanted to say is a new world history of the future. And I think it's really, really important. But here's the challenge. How do you write a history of the world without resorting to the categories that the world history that we all have read, that we're all socialized into, has already made for us? And this is not just a very abstract challenge, but a real specific challenge. So, for example, how do we tell the history of Muslims? Is there a possibility? And you could say, well, there's no such thing. There can never be a history of Muslims because Muslims, they are Turks and they're Arabs and they're people from Indonesia, etc., etc. They're all divided. But think about this. Each of those categories that I've talked about, Turks, Arabs, Indonesians, etc., 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 all of them have already been given to us in a particular way. They are a particular way of organizing particular spaces, particular subjectivity, particular identities. And part of that kind of reimagining the post-Western is also a kind of speculative fiction, a counterfactual history of what would the world look like if we knew more about, for example, Indonesia. How would we know about that? What is it? But even those categories already commit us to thinking in nationalist terms. So one of the biggest problems is to write a history of the world means to write a new history of the world, which is not a history of the ethno-nationalists. So to write a history of Muslimness or write a global history of Islam has to be a history which is not ethno-nationalist. And this is very, very difficult because every single thing that we do is permeated and saturated with ethno-nationalist categories. The third category is world making. And world making, again, is something that Mark alluded to at many points in his talk, but it is central. It is that we should not accept that the world as it is. It requires us to think and move and mobilize to create different kinds of associations and different kinds of disassociation. And this is a task which is immense, but it is the only task that will bear fruit. Otherwise, we will simply keep returning back to Orientalism. We need to be involved in a process of thinking anew about how we understand the world that we live in, how we want the world we live in to be, and what are the processing techniques that we need to foster to bring that about. Some of them we will inevitably have to borrow, but more of them we will have to innovate. And again, for a Muslim audience, I would simply say this: everyone in this room will know a lot about their faith, despite what every elder person thinks, that the young never know anything, etc. But they will know very little history about Muslims, except maybe the companions of God, unless you are a specialist in that. The ordinary history is lost, but that also means that the ordinary examples are lost. So part of world making is also a question about transforming the categories and concepts by which we understand, and understanding that we need to mobilize and to be active in that process. It is not just a process of academic study, it's also a process of active engagement with the world to transform it. So, one thing that I think is interesting to note about the recent events in Gaza. If you look at the discourse around 2006, you will note that less people were saying that Tel Aviv rules a apartheid state. Less people were talking about settler colonialism. Now those words, those concepts have now become so widespread. In a sense that ordinary people, many parts of the world, who could not identify Palestine on a map, will wear with pride Palestinian flags. And in that process, we have a situation where you have a battle of ideas in which people have started to take concepts seriously. And it is up to us to be part of that process of taking concepts seriously so that we can build this new world that will be the only way of ultimately rethinking Orientalism. Thank you. So I have there some from Q&A or comments or something like that. I have to take this. Is there a microphone? Okay, I can hear better if anyone else can hear you. That's the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Professor, for this inspiring speech. I learned quite a lot, and I realized that whatever we are teaching here, it doesn't matter what department we are working at, still just full of these Orientalist factor coming with it. So you gave us quite a bit of detail about it. So if we are to fight against this Orientalist ideas, which one is the best strategy from your point of view? Do you think it's going to be a natural result of some kind of transition because it's going to happen no matter what because of the population dynamics and so on? Or do you think something critical is necessary? Somebody will just wake up and say, wait a minute, this is Orientalism and we don't like it and we have to dismantle it. What kind of approach do you think is that approach against this kind of Western way of thinking so that we can just free ourselves in the way of thinking? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very important question. I am not a believer that things will naturally go one way or the other. I think you need to have critical work involved in a way that is saying, rather than just waiting for demographics to do this. Because I think many people believe, well, ultimately these ideas will simply take over because of demographic change, natural change, etc., etc. But what is worrying is that you have similar kind of Orientalist logics being spreading as rather than contracting. So I think rather than waiting for things naturally to happen, I think you need critical work, and I think it needs to be critical work at all levels, if that's what you want to bring about, and it has to be critical work in the context of a very asymmetrical relationship of power and authority. So I would be very, very pessimistic if we just said, well, inshallah, everything will be fine. I think inshallah, everything will be fine, but we have to do something to make it fine. And that, I think, is really, really the issue here. So if I've said anything worth saying, it is that really everyone in this room, I believe, or I would encourage them to think about the role that they have to play, whether they're students, whether they're staff, in this work, in this critical work. Because without that critical work, we would not be in a situation where we would be able to talk about the situation of Palestine as apartheid, as settler colonialism, etc. We would still be locked into the narrative which comes out from Tel Aviv or from Washington, D.C. And I think it's important for us to be able to challenge that and develop tools to challenge that. And if universities are going to be critical spaces, then that is one of the things that they can do, is help with that critical thinking.
What do you think about the legitimization of knowledge, how it is concept? It can be wrong, or what can we do, or how can we start to change the knowledge?
I think the only way that we can start is by almost beginning with the argument that we need to start. The first challenge we have is that we can't convince people that there's a need to start even. And one of the things that I would say is that we could broaden the examples by which we understand our situation. We have experience of people in, let's say, the African American experience of indigenous people. We have experience of many, many people struggling, but we can't connect them up. Our references are never that connected. So one of the things we could do is expand the diet of examples by which we understand ourselves. And that involves both recovery and innovation and alliances across places and to rethink our own place in the world. So the first thing could be even the genealogical position, to think about how the disciplines that we are actually teaching, where do they begin from? What are their roots? What are their problems? And for example, I don't know if there's anybody in sociology or anthropology in this room, but you would ask yourself, would you really need those two disciplines in a university which was not reproducing Western logic? So I would say to the formation of the disciplines themselves would be a good place to start. Okay, there don't seem to be any more questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Hocamıza teşekkür ediyoruz konuşmaları için. Hediye takdimi için Profesör Doktor Sayın Fuat Aydın hocamızın sahneye teşriflerini arz ediyoruz. On dakikalık kısa bir mola veriyoruz. Daha sonra devam edeceğiz.
Gidek mi? Bence ara.
Yeah, I know.
Sayın konuklar, Oryantalizmin farklı yüzleri başlıklı konuşmalarını yapmak ve ikinci oturumu başlatmak üzere sözü Profesör Doktor Sayın Cemil Aydın'a bırakıyorum.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. I know I'm all right. Good afternoon. Welcome to our first afternoon panel. I'm pleased to chair a very interesting panel. We will have 3 papers, and then after each paper, after all these papers, we will have a question session if we have time. Our first paper presenter came from the department. Professor Randy Shaw, University of South Wales in Sydney. She is an expert on indigenous studies from a critical geography discipline, and also works on critical theories of whiteness in Australia. And her paper title is Oryantalizmi Others Strike Back, Disrupting Dominant Cultural Narratives of Australian Race Rise to Aboriginal Parts. I look forward to the floor is yours.